dealers.
200 years ago this past week, smoke and ash lingered in the air over what remained of our nation's capital, and British troops were to blame. Mo Rocca tells the story of one fiery night.
200 years ago this month, 4,000 British soldiers lay siege to Washington, D.C. and set fire to the U.S. Capitol and the White House. And the burn marks on the White House walls are still there.
We now have evidence of the char marks, the scorching that would have happened when flames were drawn out through open windows and doors and licked up around the tops of the stone.
William Allman is the White House curator.
Is this the best evidence of the one time enemy forces were in our nation's capital?
As far as I know.
The burning of Washington was the darkest moment for the United States and President James Madison in the War of 1812, a sort of second war of American independence. The British had been interfering with American trade at sea and kidnapping sailors. American efforts to expand westward and north into Canada were being thwarted by the British. 2 years into the war, with the Americans in retreat, British forces reached the nation's capital. The Capitol dome hadn't yet been built, but the original House chamber, located on the site of today's Statuary Hall, was an architectural masterpiece, recreated in these digital images.
Many people described it as the most beautiful room in America. It had this glorious ceiling with the 100 skylights.
Was it a fireproof room?
The room was fireproof except for the ceiling, and that, of course, was the Achilles heel of the room. The ceiling was wooden, and all they had to do, of course, is to catch the ceiling on fire. When it fell down, the rest of the room would be destroyed.
And fighting with the British that night were former American slaves.
You know, the British brilliantly exposed a real weak side in American society, and that was slavery and our dependence on slaves. And
historian Steve Vogel is author of a blow-by-blow account of Washington's capture.
And they offered freedom to slaves in this region, in the Chesapeake. Said, you know, come over to our side. You know, we promise you freedom, and if you want to, by the way, you can fight against your former masters.
Moving from the capital, British Navy Rear Admiral George Cockburn, Army Major General Robert Ross, and 150 Redcoats marched to the White House. The biggest surprise? A dinner set for 40. So the British feasted in the White House dining room before burning the mansion down. Here, too, the walls survived, but little remains of what was once inside. What
Undoubtedly, this is the room with.
This is the great full-length portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart. This is the one that Dolly Madison rather famously saved. She had already packed up state papers, the red velvet drapes that she had put in the Oval Room. So then, kind of as a last-minute thing, she says, oh, we've got to save General Washington. And she gave the instructions to get it off the wall, and it was bolted on.
Hard to get off.
So they had to pretty much cut the frame open and then, you know, lift the canvas out on its stretcher.
And who did that?
Servants, the maitre d', and one of the family's slaves.
Torching the White House, the British burned the buildings housing the Departments of State, Treasury, and War, concluding one of the most devastating days in American history. Overlooked heroes, State Department clerk Stephen Pleasanton, who hid the Declaration of Independence in a Virginia mansion. 6 months later, the war ended in a virtual stalemate.